The following is an interview with Professor Dana Williams of Howard University, conducted by Lindsay Stewart at the Penn State University as part of the 2012 National Endowment for the Humanities Summer Institute on Contemporary African American Literature.
So thank you for being with us today, Dr. Williams.
Thank you for having me.
We're glad to have you. So how would you describe your approach to teaching African American literature as a tradition?
In the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years, I've taught graduate students primarily. So it really gives me the opportunity to do a lot more than I would with an undergraduate population. So it changes a little bit based on the student population. With undergraduates, I think about it as a survey in the sense that they may not have any other exposure to African American literature ever again in life.
Okay.
It's far less likely that that's the case because at Howard, students are required to take a course in the African American cluster, is what we call it. And so they do courses in history, anthropology, sociology, English. I mean, they have like many choices. But a lot of students, once they get in, based on their requirement, look for other courses that allow them to see themselves in the courses. So, but I still operate from the premise that this may be the only opportunity I have to really expose students to African American literature. So I try to give them a broad range of texts, different authors, and to have them think about everything from major movements in African American literature to major authors to major tropes, but then also to juxtapose that against people who are a little less talked about. With the graduate student population, I really try to push them to think about it in terms of an intellectual genealogy, so that they aren't thinking about African American literature as this thing that springs up with, say, Lucy Terry or Britton Hammond or Phyllis Wheatley, but to try to contextualize these writers in a longer tradition of African writing and African inscription systems, really. And in, I would say, the last 2 to 3 years, again, I try to think about it as these students are future members of the professoriate. So I teach them as though they are teachers to be.
So has your approach changed over the years?
Indeed, it actually has. Before, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, before I was exposed to a different kind of method of teaching that is related specifically to Africana studies. I did the kind of traditional approach, looked at mainstream canonized texts, thinking that students would have the opportunity to look at a different kind of discourse or a discourse that ran counter to the one that was canonized. I just assumed that students would have the opportunity to do it. But then thinking about Africana studies methodologies made me think about teaching it differently and exposing students specifically to different disciplinary assumptions. So I don't approach it now just as from the perspective of literature. I also try to bring in methodologies from Africana studies. And I'm still working through that. I'm not exactly sure how long it'll be before I'm completely comfortable with it, because my training is in English, and so I don't have this kind of tight disciplinary affinity. I'm not like wed to the discipline completely, but I also believe that there is really something to being trained in a particular methodology, and so I'm self-teaching. So I think I'll get better at it as I become more aware of disciplinary assumptions of Africana studies.
So what was your first response to Ken Warren's proclamation that African American literature has ended since segregation?
I think I had 2 different ones. My first one was, what? And then my second one was like, really? And then I actually read the text, which is of course required. I think I saw the piece in the Chronicle before I saw the book, but I had some awareness of the context of the book. So I didn't think about it probably as seriously as people who weren't aware of what had transpired like in the years prior. And then I also thought about it in the context of an earlier conversation that he had similarly about African American studies, and then again put it in the context of all of the iterations of that same kind of what is the end of the African American narrative, put it in that context. I didn't implode because I thought about it as a part of a longer conversation. Then once I actually read the text, I thought it wasn't engaging those longer conversations in a complicated enough way for me to really be hostile about it. And I admire some of Ken Warren's work in other respects. So I also put it in that context, thinking about, now what does he really mean, as opposed to what does this text actually say? So trying to infer some meaning into it was an interesting kind of exercise for me. I thought my students would have to engage it at some point, but rather than have them read it specifically as a part of a required reading for the course. I just suggested it to him. This is something you need to be aware of as a part of the conversation. And then I shared with Dr. King, at some point I'm going to have to engage this critically, so I'll use the Institute as the opportunity to do that. I actually spent quite a bit of time, about an hour yesterday, talking about it, trying to deal with the argument in terms of evidence. What is the evidence that he provides, and where are the holes in the argument? And we also discussed the idea of the premise and the presumption. If you accept the premise, you can follow, certain lines of the argument. But if the initial difficulty is with the premise, then you argue with the book throughout. Yeah. And so that was my position. I didn't agree with the premise to begin with in terms of what African American literature was, how it should be defined. So I certainly didn't agree that it had reached its end. I think there's some real complicated kinds of things that need to happen in terms of the conversation before the text just doesn't grapple with. So I think I took it with a grain of salt. I saw it as really another iteration of a kind of public intellectual conversation that's far more complicated, but that gets watered down when it's a public conversation.
So we're thinking of African American literature as a living, vibrant tradition, right? So what kind of trends or issues have currently interested you lately?
I don't know whether or not it's a trend as much as I'm real interested in the quote-unquote serious literature that's coming out, and that is becoming more difficult to find than ever, in my opinion. I have had students who've done research on the implications of having an African American literature section in a bookstore versus having to find the books in just the regular fiction, and having them really make a good case for books belonging in a regular section. But the real challenge in that regard is if you're going through regular fiction or regular poetry or regular literature in a general kind of sense, you really have to find what the new texts are. So part of the interesting thing for me is staying abreast of all of the new books that are coming out that are possible texts that I can teach in a contemporary African American literature class. So ironically, the trend is finding serious literature because the other literature is so very easy to find. And it's publicized differently, it's marketed differently. So part of what, or one of the things that I'm interested in now is really finding a way to bring those writers into the conversation and to bring more than one writer into the conversation at a time, which is always, I think, been a difficulty in African American literature. There's a chosen person, and then everyone else kind of falls off. Yeah. So bringing a lot of writers into the conversation to see, the kinds of things that are happening, what people are writing about in 2012, 2013, I think is something that I'm very interested in. I really tend to read fiction faster because it's the genre that I prefer. But there are, some good poetry that's out as well. So I don't know whether or not it's the same kind of difficulty in terms of being aware of the new books that are out in the field in the broader range of just kind of American fiction or African fiction, and then the other literature that we see that gets a lot of attention in terms of marketing strategies.
What about popular contemporary lit, like graphic novels or urban fiction? How important is it to you to bring those sort of books into a classroom?
I think it's important in part because I want my students to think about the tradition on a kind of wide range, or with a wide range. I don't want them to think that all literature looks like Toni Morrison, or all literature looks like Tayari Jones, or that all literature looks like Terry McMillan or Zane, for instance. Yeah. Contemporary writers like James McBride, whose work I really admire, trying to figure out how to balance bringing all of those texts into the classroom. I think it's important, though, again, because the students need to be aware that there are many different iterations of African American literature. I will admit, though, that I don't do as much of it as I would like to, in part because I will read differently for pleasure or for what I keep hearing people talk about, guilty pleasures, right? I'll read for guilty pleasure in a different way than works that I teach to teach. And I think it's important, for me at least, to keep that separation. If it's a book that I'm going to teach, I read with a pencil, and I'm reading as a reader and a thinker and a writer. Whereas if I'm reading with a guilty pleasure, I just get to escape into this book for an extended period of time, and that's really important to me. But I tend not to do that with African American literature. I do that more with legal mystery, thrillers or something. So.
Yeah. Right, so let's talk a little bit about the Institute. How did you prepare for your sessions?
Preparing for the Institute gave me the opportunity to read a lot.
Mm-hmm.
In part because I didn't want to just deal with my week or deal with the text that I was supposed to deal with. I wanted to put them in the context of what everyone else had done so that I could at least have the same experience that the students had, once I'm in the space. So I did a lot of reading. And then I thought about it in terms of how do you teach teachers?
Mm-hmm.
And there's some degree to which you do that as a graduate professor in a graduate seminar. But I do see a separation between my graduate students as scholars and teachers, and there really isn't a real separation, but for whatever reason in the seminar, I think about it, I'm teaching these students to be really good intellectual workers and to produce really good text and thought that manifests in the classroom as well, whereas at the Institute, I thought about it as these are teachers.
Mm-hmm.
These are scholars who are teachers, so trying to deal with like the pedagogy and trying to balance the amount of reading that they would have to do and the kinds of intellectual exercises that you would have them work through, in part because these are people who are peers for all intents and purposes, a few graduate students, but they're peers, so it really is an interesting exchange that's a little bit different from a graduate seminar, for instance. So I did a lot of reading, in part because I wanted to be completely prepared and because it forced me to read some things that I have wanted to read but hadn't had the opportunity to read. So I did quite a bit of reading and thinking before I came.
Well, thank you for your time today, Dr. Williams.
My pleasure, thank you.